In this video, I'm going to give you some tips for getting better photos out of your Sony NEX camera. Let's get into it. So it's 2020 and most of these NEX cameras are getting pretty old, but they still can take fantastic pictures as long as you follow a few rules. And rule number one is to keep the ISO as low as you can. The sensor technology isn't as good as newer cameras, which means the low light also isn't as good. And so the more you crank up that ISO, the grainier and noisier and just worse the images are gonna look on these cameras. So a good baseline is just to keep the ISO as low as you can to get the cleanest images and best quality images you can. And so I usually shoot for the lowest ISO I can go, but again, getting any picture is better than not even getting a picture at all. So if you are in really low light, feel free to bring up the ISO, but just know that the higher it goes, the more grainy your image is gonna look, and really the worse it's gonna look. So for the best quality images, keep your ISO as low as you can. And another basic rule to go by is the lower the aperture is, the more cinematic your pictures are gonna look. And now this isn't always true, but a lot of people love that shallow depth of field look that a wide aperture gives you. And so if you don't really know what that is, basically, there's a little number on the bottom of your screen probably. It says F and then 2.0 or 1.8 or 4. And basically the lower that number is, the wider your aperture is gonna be, which will give you a shallower depth of field and make your images look a little more cinematic in a sense, or make them look, I guess, better, especially with something like portraits. Having that shallow depth of field is gonna look really good. So now once you open up that aperture and make that shallow depth of field look, that's going to bring in another issue, which is focusing. With a wider aperture, it's going to be harder to keep your subject in focus because of the shallower depth of field. And so this is where focus peaking comes in. And all the NEX cameras should have this if your firmware is updated all the way. You can go right into the menu and get to it, and it's going to help out a lot for manual focusing and getting your subject perfectly in focus, because it's going to put a red outline around everything that's in focus, because that's another important thing, is keeping everything in focus. Focus peaking and a lot of practice will help you focus better and just nail your focus every time and get better pictures. All right, so another tip to get better photos is shooting in RAW and then downloading and editing software. So all the NEX cameras have the ability to shoot in RAW, and you can go right into the settings and enable it. And basically what this does is save all of the data from your image so that you can change it in post-production. So if you download an editing software like Adobe Lightroom or even some free options, you can just go ahead and search on Google free photo editing software. There's a bunch of great free ones out there. And if you shoot raw photos, you can put them right into that editing software and you can change everything a lot and really adjust your image how you want it without losing very much detail. Now most cameras straight out of the box just shoot in JPEG, which is good, and if you're not going to be editing your photos, and if you just want to use them and put them on Instagram or something like that straight out of the camera, JPEG is just fine. But shooting in RAW will allow you to adjust all the highlights and shadows and the color temperature in an editing software and make your images look a lot better and more cinematic and really adjust them how you want them. All right, my last tip for getting better photos is to invest in some vintage lenses. So you can get some old vintage lenses from like the 70s and 80s for super cheap on eBay, and they're super easy to adapt to the Sony E-mount system. And most of these vintage lenses are pretty sharp and they give a unique look to your photos and add a lot of character versus like newer lenses. And so those are the reasons that I love vintage lenses, because they're so cheap and they give this nice look to your photos that make them look more natural and less modern and digital. And so I actually made a video a while back about some of the vintage lenses that I use with my Sony a7 III, and all those lenses will work great with the NEX cameras because the a7 III and the NEX cameras had the same mount. So feel free to go check out that video, I'll link it in the description. And just go look up vintage lenses on Sony cameras or something like that on YouTube and check out some videos. And I'd recommend, for starters, getting like the Canon FD 50mm f1.8, which is what I have on my NEX5 right here. This is a great lens and you can get it for like $20 on eBay. And then I'll also link an adapter in the description. The adapters are pretty cheap as well, so you can adapt these lenses to the NEX cameras. But I definitely recommend starting out with a Canon FD 50mm f1.8. It's a great portrait lens and just gives a super unique look to all the images that it takes. And maybe even just look up Canon FD lens on eBay and see which ones, you know, are cheap and which ones you can find a good deal on. But for starters, I'd recommend a 50mm f1.8, and then after using that, you can decide if you want to go wider or even tighter focal length, and then you can really look into it from there. But anyways, that wraps up this video of my quick tips for getting better photos out of the Sony NEX cameras. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, go down and subscribe to my channel and give this video a like, and also feel free to check out my other videos. I have lots of videos about the Sony NEX cameras, so go check those out. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.